Hello, Rhonda again. Reading from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins, copywritten 1993 by Burton L. Mack. I'm picking up in part 3.4, picking up on at the top of page 184. Continuing on. Thank you for listening. Although Matthew accepted the basic plot of Mark's story and used it as the narrative outline for his own account, he had little interest in the logic of vicarious martyrdom that underlay Mark's account of the crucifixion. Thus, he worked hard to tone down those aspects of Mark's gospel that accented violence, self sacrifice, and social and political conflict. He appended some birth narratives and a genealogy to soften the beginning and link Jesus up with the epic of Israel in a totally different way. He shifted the characterization of Jesus away from Mark's man of power towards that of the patient teacher. The highly charged mythological identifications in Mark, such as Son of Man, Son of God, Messiah, and Wisdom, are all treated matter of factly as titles befitting a superior sage. And the disciples were not bumblers, according to Matthew. They understood, responded properly, and were blessed with the keys to the kingdom. Thus, Jesus' teachings were of primary importance for Matthew, not Jesus' social critique, political agenda, apocalyptic vision, or martyrdom for the cause of founding a new religion. According to Matthew, Jesus' teachings captured the best intentions of the Jewish ethical codes based on the Torah and made them available even for Gentiles. Matthew inserted Q into Mark's narrative by dividing it up into 5 blocks of instruction. These blocks were organized by theme and situated throughout the narrative as speeches Jesus gave on different occasions. The most familiar to modern readers of the New Testament is the so-called Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 to 7. To the Q material in these speeches, Matthew added some instructions of his own. He was not bashful about doing so, for from his point of view, what he added was exactly what Jesus must have intended. The most obvious and significant Matthean additions are the so-called antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount. They take the form, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." Antithesis is not the right word, however, for the point was not that Moses' law and Jesus' teachings were antithetical. Matthew made his point quite clear in his introduction to the section, which the NRSV translates as follows. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. The point of the comparison between the law and Jesus' teaching is that Jesus' teaching gets to the heart of what the law of Moses intended. For Matthew, appropriate piety was a matter of attitude, perfection of spirit, and the control of desire. Matthew read Q and wanted his readers to understand the sayings in Q as instruction in the ethical intentions of Jewish law. Matthew thought Jesus' teachings functioned to stabilize the confusion created by the end of the Second Temple State and to validate the law of Moses as that which remained constant when all else crumbled. Matthew said that Jesus fulfilled the promises and predictions of the Epic of Israel. As for the destruction of the temple, it signaled only that an epoch was ended. The new congregation of Christians, which Matthew called the ecclesia, or assembly, would take up the Jewish legacy quite nicely. When one turns to the Christian literature written during the second and third centuries, one can see that Matthew's achievement carried the day for the emerging institution of the church. His became the preferred gospel, and it was the one primarily cited as the source for the teachings of Jesus. But the citations are frequently ad hoc, out of context, and highly selective. One notices that the aphorisms of Q1, although they had lost all their bite by landing in the Gospel of Matthew, were scarcely able to carry the weight assigned them. And so, just as Matthew had found, the teachers of the church had to spell things out more clearly. Jesus was always acknowledged as the founder teacher and thus the great shepherd of the church. But as the churches settled down to codify their teachings, they looked to the apostles, bishops, and theologians for guidance, not just to the teachings of Jesus. An early Jewish Christian handbook of instructions called the Didache, meaning teaching of the Lord to the nations by the 12 apostles, does not even make the attempt to distinguish among sayings of Jesus cited from Matthew, maxims taken from the Jewish scriptures, ethical wisdom sayings taken from the Hellenistic philosophy, and instruction for prayers to be said when the community gathered for worship. So Matthew actually buried Q in the fiction of Jesus as a Jewish sage. Luckily for the modern scholar, Luke also found Q attractive for his project in early Christian historiography. Luke wrote sometime early in the second century and thought it good to trace the beginnings of the Christian movement from the time of Jesus through the period in which the apostles were actively founding churches. His plan was to show that the church, as he knew it, was true to its founders and their teachings. For Luke, being a Christian meant joining a Christian congregation. In order to do that, one received a rite of baptism, now understood as a washing, acknowledged a change of mind, later to be called repentance, received the Spirit of God at work in the congregation, and accepted the ethical standards and codes of the new community as one's own. And that was about it. One would not have joined without giving assent to what Christians believed, of course, but even that was not a very difficult thing to do. The beliefs that mattered, according to Luke, were simply that God had always wanted people to be good and had always made sure that he had a spokesman to help the people do that. For the epic of Israel, there were the prophets. Then Jesus came and surprised the world by making it possible for Gentiles also to belong to the people of God. The apostles spread this good news, preaching by the same Spirit of God that had always called the people to goodness. Some said yes, some said no, and that was that. Excuse me. So Luke did not have to struggle with the apocalyptic issues, messianic questions, political confusion, or resentment towards the Pharisees. Luke's problem was to claim for the church its rightful place in the Roman world, demonstrate that it was no threat to the Roman order, and make a case for its positive contributions to society. He accomplished these goals by lining up three illustrious epics of the people of God. an epic history that now included the Christian church. Luke used the notion of the line of prophets in every generation in order to align one, the epic of Israel, with that of the life of Jesus, history's illustration of the ideal, how it might be if every prophet teacher were perfect and everyone listened and behaved. And three, that the apostolic period, or the first chapter of the history of the church, he devised a profile of the prophet teacher to illustrate the point that the Spirit of God had functioned similarly in every epoch. The spokesman for God warned the people about the consequences of not doing good and taught the people what it meant to do good. In every case, the main illustrations in their teaching were taken from the preceding epoch and, curiously, had to do with the fate of the true prophet teacher. Some said yes, some said no. Those that said no persecuted the prophet teacher. This plan turned the notion of a line of prophets into a chain that used Jesus as a link to connect the history of the church with the epic of Israel. But it left open the question of what it meant to be good. Luke may have purposefully left this question open. As a highly educated Hellene, he certainly would have been aware that categories such as the good, the beautiful, and the true were blanks that every cultural tradition filled in differently. Luke, at any rate, refrained from spelling out the details of what it meant to be good in each of the different epochs. He did not try to equate the details of the Jewish law with the teachings of Jesus, nor the teachings of Jesus with the teachings of the apostles and whatever the codes were in his own Christian congregation. For Luke, it was enough to imagine that the people of God were the leaven of morality in any society, and that their effect on the society was constructive. Luke was certainly indebted to both Q and Mark for his conception of the line of prophets as the way to link up Jesus and the apostles with the epic history of Israel. He was also indebted to Q and Mark for the notion of the Spirit of God that provided the mythological principle of continuity from prophet to prophet and epic to epic. His remarkable astuteness lay in the fact that he was able to use the notion of the Spirit to merge the several functions of the spokesperson for God. Wise instruction, prophetic pronouncement, and miraculous effect were combined in the ideal speech of the prophet teacher. When compared with the extravagant mythologies of earlier traditions, Jesus as the Messiah, vindicated martyr, wisdom of God, Son of God, eschatological prophet, Son of Man, and so forth. Luke's mythology is rather tame, if not banal. He used it to great advantage. However, for with it, he was able to read Mark and Q together as saying essentially the same thing. Thus, he wrote his gospel in such a way as not to trouble his readers with the themes of conflict, judgment, apocalyptic reversal, and the vindication that determined the tenor of Mark and Q. All were toned down, made to appear appropriate to earlier times, and countered by the addition of other material, such as stories about good Pharisees and parables of reconciliation. Jesus, for Luke, was a man who went about doing good because the Spirit of God was upon him. So Luke incorporated Q into his gospel, but he was not overly interested in using its contents as instruction applicable in his own day. He treated Q as a period piece, one resource among many for the historian interested in developing a picture of Jesus, the prophet teacher. This is why Luke did not fuss with Q as did Matthew, either by systematically rearranging the sayings by theme or by making sure that the reader got the full import of the teachings of Jesus as Christian law. Luke saw the connections between Q and Mark in the stories about John and Jesus, and so took that part of Q and merged it with Mark as the appropriate place. He also followed the Q sequence by inserting the first block of Q1 material into the story as the Sermon on the Plain, before introducing the dialogue between John and Jesus. But from that point on, Luke turned Mark's march toward Jerusalem into a long and leisurely journey during which Jesus walked and talked with his disciples, sent them on their mission, and received their reports, had dinner with a Pharisee, performed a few healings, instructed the crowds, received a group of Galileans, and so forth. And Q was simply interspersed as the instructions Jesus gave on the way. The historian's sense of distance put Q in its place, albeit as a historian's fiction. The reader was no longer addressed directly, as in Q, by a voice speaking with immediate authority. Neither was the reader addressed indirectly, as in Matthew, by a founder teacher laying down the law for all time. In Luke's account, the reader is allowed to imagine Jesus talking to those of Jesus' own time. It was a glorious time, but it was past and the times had changed. The importance of the teachings of Jesus for Luke was not their relevance for all time, but the record they left of a marvelous teacher and prophet whose effectiveness was only that he enlarged the congregation of the people of God to include Gentiles. Thus the church was born. The irony is noteworthy. Luke's treatment of Q as a document not worth saving as a handbook of instructions relevant for his own time was the very feature of his composition that made its recovery possible in modern times. And that finishes up part 3.4, coming to terms from the Lost Gospel, the Book of Q, and Christian origins. And that was copywritten in 1993 by Burton L. Mack. Thank you for listening. Good day.